didn't scream, not when the sword came down, not when the crowd gasped, not when his golden curls were stained red on the stone. They say he raised his hands one last time, calm, almost regal, as if death was the only throne he'd ever truly be offered. And maybe it was, because Conradin of Hohenstaufen didn't die as a man, he died as a message. A 16-year-old boy publicly beheaded like a thief in the marketplace. Not for any crime he committed, but because his name, his blood, carried the weight of a world someone else wanted to forget. A world where empires rose from children, where bloodlines were dangerous, and where hope was punished harder than treason. No court in Naples would admit that. They called it justice. They called it peace. But peace bought with a child's head is just another war, wrapped in velvet, soaked in prayer. Because what really unnerved the kings and cardinals wasn't what Conradin had done. It was what he might have become. He was a symbol, and symbols, when left alive, are far harder to kill. So they severed the boy from the myth before either had time to grow. You've seen what happens when the crown turns against its own, when youth becomes liability, when loyalty becomes a threat. Some were punished not for defying the throne, but for loving too much, trusting too blindly. They weren't executed for their crimes, but for the chaos their presence might stir. What you're about to witness is only one echo in a pattern that keeps repeating. Conradin's death wasn't an end, it was a warning, and warnings like this never stay buried for long. This is not the story of a king's reign. It's the story of a boy who never got the chance. A final heir whose bloodline stretched back to emperors and visionaries, extinguished not by sword in battle, but by steel in ceremony. And before we reach the scaffold in Naples, we have to go back to the moment a baby was born under the shadow of a dying empire, back to the beginning of a life that was never meant to last. He was born already haunted. The empire his bloodline once ruled was crumbling. His father, King Conrad IV, was dying. His grandfather, Frederick II, was already a ghost, remembered more as heretic than emperor. And into that ruin, into the ashes of a dynasty hunted by Rome, a child was born. Conradin, a name too heavy for a newborn, a legacy too fatal for a boy. His mother, Elizabeth of Bavaria, wrapped him in silks, but no velvet could hide the scent of danger. He was the last Hohenstaufen, the final seed of a house that had once defied popes, broken kings, and ruled both Germany and Sicily. His blood carried centuries of defiance, brilliance, and heresy. And for that, the church would never forgive him. The moment he drew breath, they began to sharpen the axe. To the public, he was a miracle, blessed and noble, born of emperors. But inside the palaces of power, he was a ticking fuse. The church called him illegitimate. The French crown called him irrelevant. And the cardinals in Rome called him something far worse, necessary to destroy. Because a child is harmless until he has a claim, and Conradin had more than a claim. He had memory, myth. He was proof that the old order wasn't gone yet. He never met his father. He never heard his grandfather speak. But their enemies would teach him the cost of their sins. By age 2, he was declared King of Jerusalem. By age 4, King of Sicily. And by age 6, the vultures were already circling. Titles without thrones, crowns without courts, all inherited in a world that had no room for him. His uncle Manfred, his only protector, held the real power in Sicily, while Conradin remained a puppet prince in Bavaria, loved by his mother, used by the nobility, watched by the church. He grew up in palaces that smelled of old iron and winter roses, educated in Latin and law, trained to ride, to charm, to rule. But no education could teach him the truth. That the moment he tried to wear the crown in truth, it would strangle him. He was a symbol too soon, and symbols make powerful enemies. Even as a child, he felt it. The tension in the halls, the silence when his name was spoken in Rome, the letters that never arrived, the prayers his mother whispered through tears. A boy doesn't understand exile, but he can feel it. And still he smiled, still he laughed, still he believed. That was his greatest flaw. He believed the world had rules, that thrones belonged to the rightful, that justice was real. But the world he was born into didn't obey fairness, it obeyed fear. And somewhere deep inside the Vatican, they were already deciding how long this last heir should be allowed to live. As Conradin grew older, the stories about his grandfather grew darker. Frederick, the man who had debated theology with Muslims, mocked papal authority, and refused to kneel, was now a legend and a curse. And every time the boy laughed like his grandfather, every time he rode a horse like a king, the shadow thickened. He wasn't just Conradin anymore. He was what came next, and for the men in power, that was terrifying. But Conradin didn't know he was hunted. Not yet. He still believed in loyalty, in family, in destiny. He still believed his uncle ruled Sicily in his name, that the crown would one day return to him, that the world remembered what was fair. He hadn't yet learned what all broken heirs must, that in the medieval world, justice is a story told by the last man standing, and innocence is a luxury the throne cannot afford. He would learn, he would bleed for it, and when the Southern crown called, he would answer. The crown he trusted had already forgotten him. While Conradin played in Bavarian gardens, dreaming of kingdoms and songs, his uncle Manfred was tightening his grip on Sicily, supposedly in the boy's name. But names meant little in a world ruled by fear. Manfred wore his nephew's title like a cloak of legitimacy, smiling to the nobles while silently carving out his own rule. And Conradin, still a child, was left behind. The boy king became an afterthought, a legend in waiting, and legends, when left to grow in exile, begin to rot from within. It wasn't betrayal, not at first. Manfred had once been loyal, had once believed in the family name. But power is a fire that consumes affection. And somewhere between the coronation and the whispers from Rome, Manfred stopped serving the heir and started erasing him. He declared himself king of Sicily. No ceremony for the boy, no throne. No warning, just a quiet shift in titles and the final fracture of the Hohenstaufen line. Conradin was 12, old enough to read the reports, old enough to understand what it meant when even family refused to wait. But he said nothing, not then, not when his name vanished from documents, not when his sigil was removed from Sicilian banners. He swallowed it, because boys who want to be kings learn to blade behind the teeth. But Rome had not forgotten him, neither had France, and what they remembered was not the boy's laughter, but the prophecy that haunted his birth, that a child of the dragon would return to reclaim the throne, that the last son of Frederick would rise again. It was nonsense, of course, political poetry dressed as faith, but in the Middle Ages, Faith kills faster than swords, and that made Conradin a problem not just for Manfred, but for the Pope. Urban IV, a Frenchman by blood and a strategist by nature, saw the chessboard with perfect clarity. As long as Conradin lived, the Sicilian crown could not be stable. As long as he breathed, the empire was not finished. So Urban turned to France, not to send prayers, but soldiers. He invited Charles of Anjou, brother of the sainted Louis IX, to come south and take the throne of Sicily by force, a crown offered in exchange for obedience. And Charles accepted. A new predator had entered the game, one with papal blessing, French steel, and no interest in legends. By 1266, Manfred was dead, crushed beneath the weight of Charles's army at Benevento. His body was buried in an unmarked ditch, his crown taken, his forces scattered. The Sicilian kingdom now belonged to France, and the boy prince in Bavaria, he was supposed to disappear with the ashes, but Conradin didn't vanish, he didn't kneel. He didn't fade into the pages of forgotten claimants. He looked south and decided to fight, not for power, not for glory, but for what had been stolen, for the blood he carried, for the name they tried to erase. Because when boys are left with nothing but a broken inheritance, sometimes they grow teeth sharp enough to bite back. And so, in the spring of his 15th year, Conradin gathered knights, friends, poets, and loyalists. They raised banners not just of war, but of memory, of resurrection. He would ride for Italy, for revenge, for the crown that should have been his, and death would follow behind. He rode toward legend like a boy chasing a ghost. Conradin was 15, no army, no kingdom, just a claim and the shadow of a dead dynasty at his back. But belief is a weapon too, and his belief was fanatical. He believed that blood still meant something, that loyalty could be awakened like fire in dry grass, that the throne of Sicily, stolen by deceit and papal gold, could be taken back not by politics, but by destiny. It started small. A few Bavarian knights, family retainers, childhood companions, not commanders, not mercenaries, just men who remembered his father's name and the pride that came with serving it. Some joined out of loyalty, others out of madness, and some because they saw in him not a boy but a banner, a chance to resurrect a world that had been buried alive. He marched through Tyrol into Verona to the applause of citizens who hated Charles of Anjou more than they feared the church. Conradin didn't need to conquer cities, they opened their gates, not for power, but for myth. Word spread faster than armies, the true heir was coming, the South would rise again, and at every town more joined him, not soldiers, followers. Poets, priests, idealists, men whose faith in empires had long since been shattered, but who would risk death for a story worth dying for. He wore no crown, but people kissed his hands. He issued no laws, but his orders were obeyed. He had no throne, yet nobles offered their sons and silver. Conradin was becoming something more dangerous than a king. He was becoming hope. And hope, raw, naive, ungoverned, is the most unstable force in any war. The church watched in silence. Charles of Anjou did not. He tightened his grip on Naples, strengthened his garrisons, spread rumors that the boy was possessed, that his army was pagan, that the Hohenstaufen line was cursed by God himself. But the crowds didn't believe it. They had seen French knights burn villages, hang priests, butcher children in the name of order. Charles ruled Sicily by fear, and Conradin advanced through love. It was a fragile advantage and doomed. Because love makes you bold, love makes you blind. And as Conradin crossed the Apennines toward Rome, he refused to see what waited ahead. That Charles wasn't just building walls, he was baiting a trap. A perfect, beautiful, well-timed slaughter, but the boy couldn't see it. He saw a crown glittering in the distance, just beyond the hills. He thought God had cleared the road for him. He thought destiny was bending at last. And so, with 20,000 men and a heart still unbroken, Conradin marched toward Tagliacozzo, toward the battlefield that would either make him emperor or erase him forever. The trap was already bleeding before the boy stepped into it. Tagliacozzo was never meant to be a battle, it was a stage. And Charles of Anjou had been rehearsing every line in silence long before Conradin's banner crested the hills. The boy arrived with his knights gleaming in sunlight, cheered on by peasants and poets, convinced that the war had already bent in his favor. His scouts spoke of weak resistance. His commanders saw open fields. His heart, still intact, whispered that justice had come to collect its debt. But Charles didn't believe in justice. He believed in bait. On the morning of August 23, 1268, Conradin's forces clashed with the Angevin army just outside the village of Tagliacozzo. The sun was brutal, the dust clung like ash, and at first it was a miracle. Conradin's German cavalry broke the enemy line like fire through dry reeds. French knights collapsed, banners dropped, and thousands began to cheer. Victory felt real. For the first time, it felt earned. Conradin raised his hand. His followers shouted his name like it already belonged in history books. It was working. That was the moment Charles struck. From a hidden ravine behind the hills, the real Angevin force emerged, fresh, untouched, waiting. They hadn't fought. They hadn't moved. They had simply watched. And now they swept down like a blade from heaven. Conradin's cavalry, exhausted from their apparent triumph, had no time to reform. They were crushed from behind. The field turned to chaos. What had looked like a miracle was now a massacre. The dust turned red. The cheers turned to screams. Conradin fled, not like a coward, but like a boy who had never imagined the world could betray this hard, this fast. His friend Frederick of Baden rode beside him, covered in blood, urging retreat. They ran through the mountains, past loyal towns, searching for refuge in a world that had vanished. One by one, their companions scattered or were cut down. And as night fell, the prince who was supposed to become king became a fugitive. He thought he could disappear, thought perhaps he could return to Germany, rebuild, fight another day. But he was young, and the world he ran into was colder than the one he had marched from. The gates of safety were shut. The nobility who once sang his name now whispered of survival. Loyalty dried up. Coins spoke louder than memory, and one by one, the people he trusted began to vanish, until there were none left, until only a name remained. A hunted name, a royal name, a name with no army, no sword, no chance, but still too dangerous to be allowed to live. Betrayal doesn't always wear a knife, it sometimes smiles like shelter. After Tagliacozzo, Conradin was no longer a prince on campaign. He was prey, hunted not just by armies, but by silence. Towns that once cheered his name now bolted their doors. Nobles who toasted his claim just weeks before suddenly couldn't recall his face. And as he stumbled south with what few remained, Frederick of Baden, a handful of knights, dust in their lungs and blood on their boots. He wasn't just running from Charles. He was running from the collapse of everything that had ever promised to protect him. He thought he had one final chance. Torre Eschera, a coastal stronghold ruled by Giovanni Frangipani, a nobleman with old ties to the empire. A man who once called himself an ally of the Hohenstaufen. A man Conradin believed would hide him until safe passage back to Germany could be arranged. The gates opened. He was given bread, water, a place to rest. The sea just beyond the ramparts seemed to breathe with possibility. And then the gates closed. The hospitality dried. And within hours, Frangipani had sent word to Charles. The boy was here, alive, vulnerable. They didn't fight. They didn't argue. They were simply taken, shackled and marched across the countryside under heavy guard, past villages that didn't speak, past priests who dared not bless, past children who were told not to look. No one knew what to call him anymore. King, heretic, ghost. In Naples, Charles was waiting, not with a sword but with something colder, a tribunal. He didn't want to kill a rebel in the heat of battle. He wanted to kill a king in the chill of order, make it clean, legal, absolute. So Conradin was put on trial, not for any crime that could be proven, but for the crime of having existed, of carrying blood that once sat a crown, of walking into a war that was never meant for him to win. The courtroom was a theater. The verdict was already carved. There were no witnesses, no defense, just silence, ink, and iron. Even Frederick of Baden, noble, brave, loyal to the end, was sentenced beside him. 2 boys, 2 bloodlines, 2 reminders of what Charles wanted erased. Not just victory, but memory. In the final days, Conradin was allowed no public word, no audience, no letter to his mother, just a cell, a cross carved into the wall, and the taste of something sharp hanging in the air. Not steel, not fear, finality. But Naples wasn't finished with him yet, because death in the shadows was too soft. Charles wanted the world to watch, to understand, and so the scaffold was built. They built the scaffold in the center of Naples because some deaths aren't meant to be hidden. October 29th, 1268. The square was packed before sunrise. Nobles leaned from their balconies. Merchants closed their stalls. Children clutched their mothers, asked questions no one dared answer. A silent ritual had begun, and its sacrificial lamb was only 16 years old. They brought Conradin out at noon, shackled, pale, but unbroken. His blonde hair, once brushed by courtiers, now matted with sweat and dust. He walked barefoot, not like a king, not like a prisoner, but like something in between, too innocent for judgment, too dangerous for mercy. The executioner stood waiting, faceless behind his hood. A single block of wood, stained dark from the hundreds who came before, but no one in that crowd had ever seen a king kneel there. A royal heir, a child born of emperors. This wasn't a man dying for crime. It was blood being silenced, publicly, ritualistically, with steel and stone. They allowed no priest, no final rites. Frederick of Baden tried to pray, his voice cracked mid-word. Soldiers pushed him to his knees first. His head fell fast. There was no dignity, only speed. Then they turned to Conradin. He tried to speak. Witnesses would later swear he raised his voice, called out to the crowd, forgave his enemies. Others said he simply whispered a farewell, one last breath to the world that betrayed him. But the guards didn't wait for him to finish. They shoved him forward, slammed him down, and the sword came down not once, but twice. Because sometimes, even steel hesitates before killing a boy. His head rolled to the stone with a dull thud. His body trembled for a moment longer, then stopped. The executioner held up the severed head for all to see. It was not ceremony, it was declaration. The final heir of the Hohenstaufen line had been erased. The crowd did not cheer. Some crossed themselves, some turned away, and some, those who had once called him savior, stood frozen like statues carved from guilt. But Charles of Anjou had what he wanted. The boy was gone, the prophecy silenced, the crown secured, or so he thought, because what fell that day wasn't just flesh, it was meaning. And meaning, once born into blood, doesn't die with the body. It waits, quiet, rotten, unburied. And from that rot, something colder began to grow. Some corpses don't stay buried, they haunt through silence. Conradin's body was dumped in a shallow grave outside the city. No tomb, no name, no crown laid on stone. Just earth hastily packed over royal flesh, as if history could be suffocated by dirt. Charles of Anjou ordered it done quickly, without ceremony. He didn't want a martyr, he wanted a disappearance. But power doesn't understand memory, and memory, especially when stolen, tends to scream. Within days, the city changed, not visibly, not in fire or riot, but in the air, in the way people stopped speaking in public, in the way prayers were whispered instead of sung. The silence in Naples was heavier than any sword Charles had ever wielded, because the boy they had watched die hadn't looked like a threat, he had looked like a mirror. A reminder that even innocence could be butchered cleanly, legally, before the eyes of God and man, and no one would stop it. The message had been delivered, but the effect was not submission, it was contamination. Conradin's death didn't kill rebellion, it infected the idea of kingship itself. Whispers spread that he had smiled before the blade, that angels had wept, that the sword had trembled in the executioner's hand. And in the countryside, peasants began carving crude images of him into stone and wood, eyes closed, lips parted, as if still mid-prayer. Not as a king, as a boy who had believed. And that belief, more than any title, was what people began to mourn. Even nobles began to flinch when Charles entered a room. They did not fear his sword, they feared what it had killed. Because every ruler who watched that scaffold realized the same thing. If a child of emperors could die like that, so could they. The crown had just drawn a line in blood and proved that no bloodline was sacred. And in that revelation, the poison began to spread, not quickly, not loudly, but like rot in the beams of a palace, too slow to notice until it all comes crashing down. Charles had destroyed the heir. But he had not destroyed the question, what if the boy had lived? What if mercy had prevailed? What if the old world wasn't finished yet? And from those questions, rebellion would find new voices. But Conradin would never speak again. He had been erased, but the silence he left behind was louder than any scream. Justice did not die with him, but something colder took its place. In the months after Conradin's execution, Naples stood quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that follows a scream. The scaffold was dismantled. The blood scrubbed from the stones. Charles of Anjou sat secure on his throne, draped in papal favor and French steel, the boy prince now just a line in an official record. But the silence that lingered wasn't peace. It was control. Fear carefully stitched into every shadow of power. Because if a child could be butchered for a bloodline, then no one stood outside the blade's reach. The horror wasn't just in the act, it was in the machinery that made it ordinary. In the tribunal that called it lawful, in the nobles who stayed silent, in the bishops who blessed it with trembling hands. This wasn't a murder, it was a system, a crown sharpened into an executioner's tool. And from that moment on, rule by fear was no longer scandalous, it was precedent. Charles ruled with ice. He restructured Sicily like a butcher sorting meat, cleansing cities of those loyal to the old dynasty, planting his own in positions of power. Land was seized, families erased. Any peasant caught whispering the wrong name could vanish by nightfall. But even in this absolute cold, something kept slipping through. Not swords, stories. They could burn banners, but not memory. They could hang men, but not stop mothers from humming the ballads of a blonde-haired boy who once smiled in chains. Years later, when rebellions flared across the south, when the Sicilian Vespers exploded in fury, when Frenchmen were dragged from their homes and butchered in the streets, it wasn't just tax and tyranny that lit the match. It was grief, suppressed, fermented, weaponized, the kind of grief that grows teeth when left to starve too long. They didn't chant Charles's name in those fires, they chanted Conradin's, because what Charles never understood was this: you can kill a boy, but you can't kill the shape he leaves in people's hearts, especially not when that shape looks like justice denied. And long after the scaffold rotted and the banners changed, the boy's shadow remained, soft, quiet, sharpened by myth, waiting for someone to remember why the earth had trembled that day. He never ruled a day in his life, but his death reigned for centuries. Conradin was born a prince, crowned in name, raised on legacy, and crushed before he ever held real power. They said he was too young to understand war, too innocent to navigate betrayal, too naive to see the blade before it fell. But they were wrong. He understood. In those final hours, stripped of armor, silenced by law, and marched like a criminal through streets that once worshipped him, he saw the truth that most kings never face. Thrones aren't inherited, they're survived. They didn't kill him because of what he did. They killed him because of what he reminded them of. A world where honor wasn't yet extinct. A bloodline that refused to fade. A future they couldn't control. That's why the axe was raised. That's why the square was packed. That's why no one spoke when his head dropped. Because deep down, everyone knew this wasn't justice. It was fear dressed as order. A warning carved into flesh, aimed at anyone who believed that birthright could stand against power. And that warning didn't end in 1268. It returned, again and again, in royal sons chained in their own castles, in favorites tortured beside their kings, in whispers of love turned to execution. If Conradin's story shook you, then you need to see what happened when another crowned boy was betrayed not by enemies, but by his own crown. Watch the fall of Edward II and the brutal death of the man he loved, Hugh Despenser. Their story isn't just history, it's what happens when power decides love is treason. Subscribe to Tortures of the Crown for more untold stories of blood, betrayal, and crowns that devour the very heads they rest upon. The throne remembers, and so